Welcome everybody at Talks at Google and Cambridge office. My name is Eva Dürr and I'm a site program manager for the Munich site. Woo! All of those that will be looking and watching that video later on from Munich. So I have a great pleasure to welcome today at Talks at Google Professor John Rivkin from the Harvard Business School. Since 2011, he co-chaired the project on U.S. competitiveness with Professor Michael Porter, and he will talk about that today. This project unleashed a number of discussions around the business leaders on how to make U.S. Health and economic growth grow. And when I was talking about the talks at Google with Professor Rivkin, we laughed a little bit around the cases that we discussed at Harvard around 2000, 2002 about Yahoo and Lycos, where some of the students were arguing heavily and intensely that search and internet portals will become commodity and there's no money to be made there. Well, this turned out to be a little bit different story. Without further ado, I just want to welcome Professor John Rivkin on stage.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for the kind introduction. You mentioned the old Yahoo and Lycos cases that I wrote. The story is actually even worse than that. It turns out I also wrote a case years ago on Microsoft's efforts in search, what became Bing. So you may think that I am some kind of, bad luck charm bringing harm to every search company I visit. You might want to escort me to the door before I cause any damage to Google. I do want to reassure you, I have written some cases on some successful organizations as well. So it is remarkable. 20 years ago, you could write a case in the online space and never mention Google. And yet here we are, and the company is one of the most influential organizations on the planet. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to share with you some of the work we've done on U.S. competitiveness. This work has been done as a project team, about 24 faculty involved to date. I will, of course, speak to myself, but I just want to acknowledge the debt I owe to my colleagues in that regard. Truly joint work. Now, when I got the nice invitation to come speak with you today, I, of course, did my homework. I looked at some prior talks. I noticed some of the talks were deeply analytical, just what I would expect from Google. Some of them included a call to action. And I'm going to try to do both today. The analytical part will delve into the lack of shared prosperity we see in the American economy. Once upon a time in America, the prosperity we generated was shared pretty broadly, so that rich Americans, middle-class Americans, poor Americans, we either thrived together or we struggled together, and since all boats either rose or fell with the tide, the challenge was fairly straightforward. How do we keep the tide coming in, right? But that is not what we see in the American economy today. Instead, what I think we see is an economy doing half its job, where big companies and the people who work for them and invest in them are doing pretty well, but working class, middle class Americans are struggling, as are many small businesses. And I've become convinced this is the #1 economic, social, and increasingly political problem in our country, that many of the things that might concern many of us, the rise of populism, even the financial crisis of the last decade, are as much causes of that lack of shared prosperity as independent events in and of themselves. And I want to share with you some fairly sobering symptoms, as well as offer a diagnosis before I move to the prescription. Now with the prescription, that brings me to the call to action. And the call to action is embodied in the title of the talk, Will We Restore Shared Prosperity in America? I chose the title very deliberately. It's not can we. Sometimes you read stuff out there that makes it feel like the economic outcomes will be dictated by inexorable forces of global change or technological change. I actually believe those forces are extraordinarily important, but I also believe what we have here is essentially a social choice. We get to decide. And I want you to take the talk personally. I believe that people of Google, individually and collectively, can actually help to shape and make that social decision. It will require, I believe, an approach that's not discussed as much as it should be, an approach that I'll try to highlight and illustrate when I move to the prescription, an approach that I actually see already implicit in some of the social and philanthropic efforts of the company, but an approach that I think is actually made more powerful if we make it explicit. So that's where I'm heading. I want to start with the symptoms and some facts about prosperity in America today. I'm going to start with the good news. I will warn you, the good news is not going to last for very long. And this is going to be a bit of a roller coaster ride. I promise everyone you cannot leave without an equal and opposite offsetting dose of optimism by the end, okay? But bear with me through some of the sobering stuff. The good news first, though. Total prosperity in America. Turns out we're generating lots of prosperity in the country. One indicator of this is gross domestic product. Here we've got real GDP in America over time indexed back to 1995. Shown versus Europe and Japan. And the good news is that, in fact, the American economy powered into and powered out of the Great Recession stronger than the other advanced economies of the world. Now, it turns out the growth rates here, they are lower than what we saw in the years immediately after World War II. They're relatively low, but the total pie is growing pretty well. Now, part of that pie shows up as corporate profit. This looks like good news, too. So it turns out when you look at corporate profit, either as a portion of GDP in red and on the right, or in total real dollars in blue and on the left, corporate profits are close to all-time record highs. Okay, so the corporate part of the pie is just doing fine. Now I want to turn what is happening outside of the corporate sector, and I'm going to start by focusing on income, right? A key indicator of prosperity, and income distribution. I'm going to actually look at income from like 4 different angles so you can see different aspects of it and you can kind of total it up. And I'll also look at 2 things that drive it, job growth and startups. With income, I want to start with, I think, a tremendously interesting and sobering analysis that some colleagues at Berkeley and in France did very recently. They took the income distribution, they looked at individuals in each percentile, okay? And they asked, over the first half and the second half of the post-war period, how did income grow for individuals in each percentile of the income distribution? So this is the first half of the post-war period, 1946 through 1980, and this is different points in the income distribution. And first of all, the good news is the line as a whole is pretty high. That's terrific. And in fact, the poorest Americans saw the greatest percentage gains in real income, and the richest Americans saw modest gains, but still gains, but lower gains. Now we move forward to the second half of the post-war period, 1980 through 2014, and the line rotates dramatically, okay? Right, I mean, your gasp is exactly my reaction as well. So what do we see here? We see the poorest Americans basically not, barely keeping up. We see the very, very, very wealthiest Americans seeing unprecedented gains in income over time, right? So there you got the whole distribution. Let's now zero in on one particular point. Let's zero in on the median and look at the median over time, because we had a world, we had a country of shared prosperity. We'd expect to see median household income in real terms and in inflation-adjusted terms going up over time, right? We might see ups and downs around recessions, but generally an upward trend. If you look back far enough at median household income, that's actually what we saw, right? From 1975 here to around the year 2000. There's ups and downs around the recession, basically an upward trend. But then things peak in 1999. We see stagnation, decline. We do see some gains in recent years. And in fact, the data that were released 2 weeks ago showed that real median household income exceeded the 1999 peak for the first time. People celebrated, and we should celebrate. We should also keep in mind exactly what we're celebrating. We're celebrating that we are back to where we were 17 years ago, okay? This is not just true at the median. It's true all the way down to the very bottom of the income distribution. It goes up to around the 95th or above percentile, that since 1999 we've seen essentially stagnation, decline, and then recovery. So that's deeply sobering. Another thing is just looking at how it's spread geographically. So let's now zero in on 15 years from 1999 to 2014 and look at the change in real median household income, but now let's do it by county in the US. And what you see here is declines in real median household income in the reds, the oranges, the shades of yellow, and increases in the blues and the whites. And you can see deep declines in the Midwest, deep declines in the South, the Northeast and the Rockies not quite as bad. You actually see gains in a big chunk of the country where there are very few people. And you can essentially make out the oil shale fields in North Dakota and West Texas, right? If you squint very hard, you can see some highly populous but prosperous pockets on the coast. So you can see Boston, you can see the Bay Area, you can see Washington, D.C., you can see LA. But both in terms of the gains across the income distribution and also gains across the country, really uneven outcomes on median household income, right? The last angle on income I want to give you is something that colleagues in the econ department at Harvard and Stanford have shown recently. I think a very clever analysis. They basically ask first, what is the American dream? And they realize that at least one key component of it is, my kids are better off than I am, and I'm better off than my parents. So they took tax records, looked at income, and linked together parents and kids. And they can look at people in different birth cohorts and ask, for instance, for someone born in 1940, when they are age 30 in 1970, are they better off than their parents were when their parents were 30 years old? It turns out for someone born in 1940, the answer was about 90% of them were better off than their parents at age 30, okay? But you can see the decline in this figure all the way to those born in 1984 who turned 30 in 2014 when the data set ends. Turns out only half of them are better off than their parents were at age 30. So it's gone from being a kind of 90%, almost a sure bet, to being a coin toss. Now, I promised sobering data, right? So we sobered so far. I'm afraid you are. I want to look at two underlying drivers of income and prosperity and shared prosperity. One is job creation, another is startups. So on job creation, I want to take a quick look at the Great American Job Machine, right, which clearly is a driver of shared prosperity. And here's one way to look at it. It's the rolling 10-year compounded annual growth rate in the number of private sector jobs in the country. So the number for 1985 was 2.7%. That means in the decade before 1985, the economy produced new jobs at an average annual clip of 2.7%, right? And you can see that for a long period, the Great American Job Machine can be counted upon in any given decade to produce new jobs at about 2% clip per year. It'd be ups and downs within the decade, but give me a decade, I can give you 2% annual growth. And then somewhere around 2000, something happens. The job machine starts to sputter, right? And we drop to historically low rates of job growth, which for working and middle-class Americans is a deeply distressing outcome. I also want to turn, particularly for this crowd, turn to startups, right? I think most of us have the impression, certainly on campus where I live, it seems like it's the golden age of startups. Like if you're at HBS as an MBA and you're not involved in two startups, people were wondering what you're doing with your time, right? And I think, when you think about it, barriers to entry have fallen. We can now, outsource production. We can market via Google. We can deliver via UPS. Seems like barriers to entry have come down. It turns out that impression is true inside a particularly small bubble. If you actually look at the startups as a portion of all U.S. firms, it's been in steady decline since the late 1970s. On Tuesday of this week, they actually released the 2015 data. It's up a tiny little bit, a tenth of a point. Now, just to remind you again, it's not that we're not producing prosperity, it's that we're not producing shared prosperity. Just to reinforce that, here's a chart where we look at two things. On blue and on the left, the average income in real dollars among those in the bottom 99% of the population over a very long period of time, going back basically to when we started doing income taxes in America in 1913. And then in red and on the right, what happens for those in the top 1%. So you can see very clearly from around the end of World War II through the mid-1970s, this is essentially the golden age of the American middle class. And then from the mid-1980s until very recently, maybe even today, the golden age of the 1%. So we've got a situation where we see a true deep lack of shared prosperity in the country, and I'm sorry to show you the baby from different angles, but the baby is ugly from each direction, I'm afraid. What's going on? We need to move from just the symptoms to the diagnosis. I want to offer a basic narrative that I think captures a lot of what's going on. It's not going to capture everything, all right, but I think it'll capture the basics. It starts with an idea, and it's an idea that my colleagues Gary Pisano and Willie Shee have really made central in my own thinking. It's the idea of the commons, that there are certain shared resources that every citizen, every community, every company relies upon in order to be productive and prosperous. Every community needs an educated populace, needs a skilled workforce, needs strong infrastructure, some basic R&D, right? And the truly amazing thing about the United States historically is that locally invested companies and a functioning government at the federal and the local level managed to invest deeply and build the most productive commons the world has ever seen. In fact, we not only built a productive commons, we were innovators in this, from the Transcontinental Railroad to the interstate highway system, from universal public education in the 1840s to the GI Bill after World War II. We innovated it in building the commons. Now, I do want to be very, very clear. This was not good for everyone. Like the good old days was not, it just weren't so good across big portions of the population. The interstate highway system cut through the heart of many African American neighborhoods. The GI Bill was not shared equally across the population, either racially, and very few women benefited from the GI Bill, for instance, but for a big chunk of the population, we built a strong commons. Then what happens? We hit around 1980, and we see changes in geopolitics, changes in technology, changes in governance suddenly create automation and globalization. It becomes possible to do business from anywhere to anywhere, and we start to get new technologies for automating jobs, right? And this had tremendous benefits for the U.S. economy. Let's be very clear, this was beneficial, but it tended to weaken the connections between companies and their communities, the connections that had made companies eager to invest in the local commons. If I am born in a small city and I know that I'm going to be starting my business, growing my business, and living in a community where I've got to rely upon the local public education system, I've got really strong incentives to make sure that school system operates well. So we've got now a situation where there's globalization and additional automation. So maybe I can replace individuals with machinery, so the incentives to invest in the commons among businesses deteriorates. This, of course, puts intense pressure on the middle class in our society, right? Middle class, working class finds itself in intense competition for jobs with hundreds of millions of ambitious, skilled workers around the world, and also implicitly competing for jobs against technology that's improving at the rate of Moore's Law, okay? On the other hand, on the other end of the skills distribution, if you happen to have unique skills that you can market globally and can be leveraged by technology, this is a great moment, right? So income inequality starts to rise at this point. Then the next question becomes, how did we as a society respond to pressure on the middle class? We could have doubled down, I think, on making the middle class so educated, so skilled, so supported by strong infrastructure and other parts of the commons that it can compete with anyone, anywhere around the world, right? Instead, what we honestly did, and let me be clear, I think, I don't want to pin this on one political party or another. I think there's enough blame here to go around, actually. I think what we did as a society is we made a series of unsustainable promises to maintain the illusion of shared prosperity even as things started to deteriorate. They're promises like, please, middle class, don't worry about your stagnant household income. We will extend additional credit to you. Please go out and buy more stuff, particularly buy houses, right? So after the dot-com bubble bursts, we keep interest rates low, encouraging house buying, and we build a bubble which we come to live with during the financial crisis. Promises like the government will directly cover your healthcare costs during your retirement, and promises like we'll do all of this while lowering tax rates in every tax bracket, right? You take those promises, you couple them with 2 wars and a nasty recession, and you wind up with a government which is both financially hobbled and politically divided. And where do the cuts come? Basically, they come in investments in the commons, right? So you wind up with footloose firms and a hobbled government. And who's making the investments in infrastructure and individuals and innovation and so forth? Unfortunately, not enough anywhere, right? Now, one particular look at this issue comes from surveys we've done as part of the competitiveness project of our alumni. So we're fortunate to have tens of thousands of alums around the world who will generously share their perspective from the front lines of global capitalism. Among the things that we've asked them to look at a bunch of elements of the business environment in America, which prior research has shown to be drivers of competitiveness and drivers of shared prosperity. And about each of these, we asked them 2 basic questions. The first question was, how's the US doing compared to other advanced economies? That'll become my horizontal axis. And then we've asked, what's America's trajectory? Are we getting better, staying the same, getting worse in each one of these? And that'll be the vertical axis. Now, the great news about the US is, in fact, we've got some great strengths that are getting even better. We've got a great context for innovation. We've got vibrant capital markets. We've got high quality firm management. We've got great research universities. The problem is those strengths are weighed down by other strengths that are getting worse. Our pools of skilled labor, our macroeconomic policy, for instance, our regulatory system, and by weaknesses that are getting worse in the eyes of our alums. A convoluted tax code, a paralyzed political system at the national level, a costly healthcare system, a very patchy, uneven K-12 education system, and logistics infrastructure with significant weaknesses. Now, if you stare at that chart, you can essentially see, with a little bit of squinting, the underlying drivers of the lack of shared prosperity in the country. Because think about it, if you're a large corporation, you're running a large corporation, what do you need to do well? You need access to innovation. You need great research universities. You need great capital markets. You need great firm management. And frankly, if you don't like the national environment, you are you're like one tax code, one inversion away from getting away from the convoluted tax code in the US. You can source talent from around the world. So the K-12 system is not a barrier to your progress. On the other hand, if you are working a middle-class American, you bring to work your education, your workforce skills, and you can't escape the consequences of the national political system. You can't escape the consequences of the healthcare system. So essentially what you've got is large firms that can tap the strengths of the economy and can escape the weaknesses, and many, many citizens who are reliant upon the weaknesses and can't escape from those weaknesses as well, and very rarely actually tap into the strengths. So that diagnosis, it acknowledges things that are kind of inexorable forces like globalization, technological change, but it also says, look, we have here a self-inflicted wound. The self-inflicted wound is systematic underinvestment in the commons, on which many, many Americans depend. And the question becomes, how might we fix that problem? And this leads to the prescription and ultimately to the call to action. On the prescription side, let me lay out, with a little bit of caricature, what I hear is the major ways people talk about restoring shared prosperity in America. There are folks who will basically, and I will confess, I think these are largely politicians, who will essentially say, my plan is to reverse time, okay? I'm going to stop globalization by putting up barriers, and we're going to tax the robots, and we're going to basically, don't worry about automation. You could probably hold back the tide a little bit there for a little bit, but I think if America resists the future while the rest of the world embraces it, the country will not wind up in a good place in the long run. Second, you hear lots of talks about efforts to redistribute income, to redistribute the gains very directly, a more progressive tax code, higher minimum wages, at the extreme, universal basic income, right? Once you start talking about these, one's politics quickly come out to the front. I'll confess mine. I think we need to talk about these things very seriously, right? I also live enough in the real world to realize that legislatively, these things are not likely to happen, right? So we have to find other things. If we're serious about restoring shared prosperity, We individually, in our own way, may work on those. We have to work on other things as well. The third category, I'd say, is efforts to boost overall growth rates. There are people who say, look, what we really need, let's just boost overall growth, and then the boats will rise with the tide. If you really believe that prosperity in aggregate will automatically bring shared prosperity in the country, you've kind of not been paying attention for the past couple of decades. And then finally, and where I find the greatest hope, is efforts to restore the commons, and these are region by region efforts. They are local efforts, and they are cross-sector. They involve business almost all the time. They never involve only business. And they are highly innovative, and I'll just lay out a few examples to give you a taste, a concrete taste of what I'm talking about. So one of my favorite ones involves a company called Southwire. Southwire is a multi-billion-dollar maker of cable and wire. There's a 1 in 5 chance their product is actually in your wall at home, or in my wall, but we don't know it, right? The chief executive of Southwire realized he had a problem. He had committed to hire only high school graduates. And in rural Carroll County, Georgia, where the company is based, there just weren't enough people graduating from high school. So he and his team partnered with the local school district and said to the school district, bring us the most at-risk students in your system. Okay, the people you are confident are going to drop out. And we will build a dedicated factory staffed entirely by at-risk high school students, managed by teachers and by Southwire managers. And the students, if they go to school in the morning, can then work a 4-hour shift for pay at Southwire in this dedicated factory in the afternoon. So it turns out this leads the graduation rate for these at-risk students to go flying through the roof. It's actually above the system average. The graduation rate among at-risk students who are in the county but not in this program, even that goes up because of peer effects. The managers at Southwire who are doing this adore doing this. It gives extra meaning to their work. The school system is delighted. And then here's the kicker for me. It turns out that a well-managed, well-trained high school student is about 35% more productive than a grown-up. So the factory that they hope might one day break even actually starts to print money in month 3, money they then reinvest in growing the program. So that's just one example. You can see cross-sector, it involves business, it involves educators, it involves the local government to some extent, and it makes a difference to building the commons in that community. Siemens, global multinational. Their energy equipment business is based in Charlotte, North Carolina. They realized they had a problem. Their problem was they could not find enough advanced manufacturing workers in the local workforce. So, Siemens can go anywhere. But instead, they say they're going to double down in North Carolina. They partner with Central Piedmont Community College, essentially to train the workers they would love to hire, right? So this means a deep partnership. It means, helping to reform the curriculum in the community college. It means donating equipment. It means donating software. It means a change for the community college, too. They've got to take their instructors, change the curriculum, send them to Germany to understand the apprenticeship in Germany, the apprenticeship system in Germany. But the consequence is a highly skilled workforce, which is useful not only for Siemens, but also for other advanced manufacturers in the community. So once again, multi-sector, local in its character, and also in this case and in other cases involving young leaders. I may come back to the Itasca project if we have time, but the Young American Leaders Project, this is my personal favorite because I've been deeply involved in this one. One thing we realized at Harvard Business School as we collected scores upon scores of examples like this of local cross-sector collaborations that were rebuilding the commons, making a difference in the individual communities, what we realized is the ideas weren't spreading. They were bottled up in local communities. We'd go to Nashville and talk about what we'd seen in Chattanooga 3 hours down the road, and they hadn't heard of it. So we launched the following effort. We chose 9 cities and went to senior leaders in those cities and said, look, identify for us 10 young leaders who you believe will help lead the city in the next generation. And they should come from business and government and nonprofits and educational institutions and faith-based organizations from anywhere in the community, right? Just bring them to us, and 9 cities times 10 people, now we've got a classroom full, right? So we bring them to campus for essentially a week-long boot camp in cross-sector collaboration for shared prosperity. And I want to tell you, if you want to feel optimistic about America, turn off CNN, turn off Fox News, put down the newspaper, and spend a week in the classroom with these young leaders. They're truly inspiring, truly extraordinary, the things they're doing. So this brings me, in fact, to my kind of call to action for you. I've had the privilege of having a lot of my students either come from Google or go to Google afterwards, or to other highly influential organizations. And I think one of the great pleasures of working at a place like Google is you get to ask yourself every day, am I changing the world, right? But I want to add a question to your list, and the question is, am I changing my community, right? Am I changing my community in collaboration with cross-sector leaders in other parts of the community? Am I working well to build the commons in my community with leaders in local government, leaders in nonprofits, leaders in educational institutions? Because I think ultimately that kind of collaboration involving businessmen, involving many others, and working at the local level to build the commons and bring back shared prosperity, that is the best bet we have right now. So thanks for hearing me out on this. Let me open it up for questions, thoughts, reflections. I'd love to hear how you think about this.
Yeah, so your call to action is very well taken. We certainly all have a responsibility. But in studies of income inequality that I've read, another huge factor is a strong correlation between this overweening strength of the financial sector. That excess and anomalous returns to the financial world, lower regulation seems to be very strongly correlated with income inequality. Hedge fund, billionaires being taxed, less at carried interest rates, and so on. And a lot of those people are HBS grads. So to what extent can I turn the tables and ask, is there institutional responsibility?
It's a very fair question. The easy answer to is there institutional responsibility is yes, right? And just to drive home your point, when you look back at this chart, you ask who are these individuals up here, and they're disproportionately in the financial sector, right? So boy, it's a great question. I am certain the question is better than the answer I will give it. So yes, there is an institutional responsibility, I think, to encourage our students to think broadly about how they create value before capturing value, right? And in fact, it goes back to the very early history of Harvard Business School. The first dean, his statement to the mission was to educate people to make a decent profit decently, right? I think that there are, in fact, steps that we and our peer institutions have made. We have a first-year course that looks entirely at leadership and corporate accountability. That asks what are your responsibilities to all your stakeholders. We've got colleagues Rebecca Henderson, and George Serafim teaching a course called Reimagining Capitalism, which asks the question, can capitalism be a source of solutions to the world's thorniest problems? They focus on climate change, inequality, and corruption. And I think we often think of business as being a cause of those problems. And they ask, can business in fact be a solution to those problems? And it's a highly oversubscribed course. And I've got literally dozens of colleagues who look at the future of market capitalism and conclude that we've got to have changes in that. Lynn Payne and Joe Bauer in a recent Harvard Business Review article basically came to create very similar to yours, asking if the focus on devotion to shareholder value alone leads to outcomes in our society that are unsustainable. So I think we've got many folks who are looking into how we address these. I personally would like to see changes in how we treat, for instance, carried interest. I also am fairly sober about the legislative changes there that would be required to pull that off. Perhaps you're more optimistic than I am about that route. I don't know. Would you say you are, or?
It's tough to say, right? I mean, the current climate doesn't seem conducive, but we have had more equitable situations, in the past, and so
absolutely.
maybe the silver lining in today's situation. If things are perceived to be broken enough, that'll create momentum for change.
Yeah, and the last time we saw inequality at this level was right before the Great Depression, right? And that induced in a horribly, traumatic way for our society many of the changes that I suspect you would be very supportive of. My hope is that we can do it this time without a Great Depression and a World War. But I'm also, I feel very sober about that. And I look at how financial regulation of the financial sector has gone since the financial crisis, and I worry that we've made very little progress. It is why I place my personal bets at the local level, where I see, particularly local politicians, it turns out, that there's just a greater degree of accountability because their trash has got to be picked up and the snow's got to be cleared. And otherwise there are consequences. They're very real and almost immediate. I'd love to see changes at different levels, but I try to work where I think I can make a difference. And I encourage others to work at both levels. Please, other thoughts, reflections?
Thank you so much. This is amazing. I probably have 1,000 questions, but the one that comes to my mind, I'm just interested in your perspective, is when we talk about barriers to reaching the shared prosperity. One of the places that at least I place a lot of blame is the media. And I think they don't have they aren't driven by this, right? Like a shared prosperity doesn't really rise their tide. It's almost like the divisiveness and getting people that bad news is what sells. Like, how do we overcome a society when we have a us versus them, a CNN versus Fox News, and people are driven down by wherever they are? And it's sort of like, how do we, if you have an entire industry that's not built around shared prosperity, how do we ever achieve it?
Wow. Okay, so that's a huge, deep question, and we're going to say the very same thing. My answer probably will be so. First thing I reflect on is there's a reason the word media is plural, actually, right? I think there are many, many media out there, and I see some that do cover the good news and really are focused on this, and I see some that seem to benefit by feeding the divisions in our society. And actually, I worry, if anything, that the media is being beaten down and it plays an important role in our body politic, and it's being delegitimized. So while I will criticize parts of the media, I also want to come to their defense at this time. I do think, well, at least one piece of good news here is that these innovative cross-sector collaborations actually do attract a fair amount of media attention. And they just choosing some local examples. So John Feynman has started inner-city weightlifting. I don't know if Google is actually, I know Microsoft here in Kendall Square is involved. This is an effort to get businesses and others engaged in keeping individuals with records of incarceration employed, positive, and not going back to jail, basically. Turns out rates of recidivism are just insanely high. And partly because there's just no opportunity. Because you come out of jail and the first thing someone asks you is, have you been incarcerated? Yes, you have. Thank you for applying, but no thank you for the job, right? So inner city weightlifting is an effort to train the individuals coming out of jail to be personal trainers, and particularly personal trainers for, in part, people of real means who can then create opportunities for these individuals. ICW, inner city weightlifting, has got a lot of publicity in the local area. It could use even more, but it's gotten a lot. So I do think there's a possibility. Can I turn? So I got to tell you, I'm a case method instructor, so my natural inclination is to turn the question back. What do you think?
Like I said, I couldn't agree more about the role that the media is going to have to play to get us out of this. I just think there are, like I said, I think if you look at the worst of it, they're driven by division, because the more division, the more people are going to tune into their news and the breaking news and everything else. And I think it's also somewhat scary that what drives people, when you look at it from the emotional standpoint, is risk and fear. And so it's like when you look at individual gains, be it from media companies or individuals in the political world, it's like if you're tapping into that emotion, it's what's going to get you to continue to tune in, continue to click. So I don't know. I'm fearful of how do we break that cycle.
So for some reason, division sells for the media, right? They're not choosing to publicize division because they just like division. I don't
Right.
think. I think actually there are strong incentives. So how can we recreate a media where unity sold instead? And can you think, I mean, I'm going to make it very concrete. Can you imagine doing things within Google so that the other kinds of stories actually were highly attractive to individuals? Or maybe it's something deep in the customer base where we just like division and we love bad news, but I don't know that's the case.
Yeah, no, I think there is a lot, and I think these companies are doing a ton, including Google. I fear that other sides of the equation will just talk about these bubbles that these companies live in. Or, I mean, obviously Google was just in the news recently for, someone coming out and saying that we're all living in a bubble and kind of the repercussions from that. So that's the hard part of it's like the us versus them has been solidified wherever the blame goes, and it's sort of like how do you break out of that mentality?
So here's my question. I like to imagine a world in which the creativity of companies like Google and the innovativeness, a portion of it got focused on these issues. I know to some degree they already are, right? But if you really you turned the battleship and aimed it straight at this kind of problem, imagine what kind of technological innovations you could have that would make a difference. I'll just mention one very small one, which a student at HBS did almost overnight right after the election. I don't know if any of you saw Hello from the Other Side. So it was a website that basically, if you were on one side of the election or the other, would pair you up with someone from the other side so you could have a civil conversation, right? Kind of break down the bubble, and it's not high tech, right? It's not huge. I'm just wondering what kind of innovations are out there that we've not even thought about, because I do think this is a broader point, a speculative point. Part of the underlying issue is the mechanisms for collective action in our society, and to some degree, the mechanisms for collective action have been undermined in recent years by various forces. So imagine, for instance, global mobility. When you were in a little town, you actually really had incentives, and you were never going to live outside that little town. Your incentives to work with your neighbors and make sure the school systems were good, and the parks were good, and the art museum was good, were enormous, right? Global mobility comes in, and collective action becomes harder. On the other hand, I see in technological change incredible examples of collective action that would be mind-boggling. If I had told you 2 decades ago that every day you and I would rely upon a crowdsourced encyclopedia, right? First of all, you wouldn't know what crowdsourced meant, right? But when someone explained it, you would have said, I was crazy. And you'd be right. And yet there's Wikipedia. So there are these emerging mechanisms for collective action. The question is, can we harness them toward building the commons that we need faster than the old mechanisms decay? So I don't know if it makes sense to you, but I think there's a positive outcome here and a positive outlook. So I saw some other questions, and let me field them if I may.
How does automation play into this? You mentioned it earlier, but
Yeah.
with respect to middle class and specifically the jobs that will be there for the middle class, like what role does automation play? And it's probably changing year over year over year, pretty rapidly.
So that question has kept a generation of economists happy, or as close as they can attain that state. I think actually the best answer I've seen to that is actually a talk by David Autor of MIT. Which you can Google it and you can find it. I think it's called "Why Are There Still So Many Jobs?" Right? Because we've gone through many phases where people say the machines are taking our jobs. Right? When we went from agriculture to mass manufacturing, we were sure there weren't going to be enough jobs. Right? And what happened? It turns out that we human beings can consume more things insatiably, right? And there's always either things or services, and so there are jobs. And so I think the answer to the question, will there be jobs in the future? Yes, absolutely. Will you have a job? For the folks in this room, yes. More broadly, yes, you'll have a job. I think the question is, what job will it be? Will it be a good job? And for sure, it will be a different job. And that brings with it, I think, a deeply challenging time period where there will be shifts in jobs and shifts in the skills needed by individuals. And I think the folks in this room, by and large, are on the positive side of that, right? Both because you've got the skills that are needed in the future, and because you've got the ability to attain skills you don't have today. Unfortunately, our education system has not equipped a lot of people in the country, or it has failed to equip many people in the country for that. And so the question becomes, how do we change that system? This is where I think technologically inclined individuals and their companies can make a massive difference. Right now, the race I see is sobering. The first thing you should know is when you see people point to globalization and automation, they should say globalization in a whisper and automation in a loud voice. As far as I can tell from the data, the job losses that you see are about 86% automation, about 14% globalization. You never know that from listening to the political discourse, right? It's all about globalization and outshoring, and I think the reason, honestly, is it's much easier to say the problem is someone in China has your job, preferably someone who doesn't look like you has your job, and I'm gonna fix that, right? And not to say it's automation and your skills aren't advancing fast enough. So that's the first thing. So automation, huge thing. And then in turn, what I find the most sobering about this, and I've talked to a number of venture capitalists about this, you talk to VCs, and they'll work through their portfolio. And a lot of the portfolio involves things they know will displace jobs. They'll also create jobs, but they'll displace jobs. And then occasionally an enlightened one will ask, will say, I'm also looking for an investment in retraining, because I know there's going to be some huge need for retraining. And yet I can't find the organizations that are doing retraining in an innovative, massive way. And so I think the main social challenge we've got is how do we make the transition? And particularly, can we bring some of the tools that technology brings to enable that? And I haven't seen anyone with a great answer to that. And what worries me the most is I see the private sector creating the automation, and I see the retraining largely in the public sector, and I kind of know how that race is likely to end, right? So, and it's deeply, deeply worrying. Other thoughts or questions? Yes, please.
So one of the arguments I've heard from people who tend to be on the extreme conservative or liberal side of the spectrum, when confronted with this type of data, is that yes, but people in the lower income percentile actually don't have it as bad as they did during the Great Depression.
Right.
So it's not really so bad because of technology. And that will continue to make people's lives better across the board. And I just wanted to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, no, I think there's it's a great question. I think there's some real truth in it, and there's also evidence that points against it. I think the real truth in it is we have a hard time putting into economic terms adjustments for how better off am I because I've got access to my smartphone, right? And the economic technology for accounting for that is not very good. The other evidence I see, though, is if things are so good at that end of the income distribution, why are people so mad, right? I don't see, I don't have a great answer to that question, right? So for sure we should get better at measuring, but I think we also have to look in the eye the monster that's out there. And and there's another, I think, deeply interesting question. Some of my colleagues work on it. I don't. And that is, what are the determinants of happiness, right? Is it actually absolute or relative wealth? And if it's relative wealth, then yes, I'm better off in absolute terms than people during the Great Depression, but I'm actually no happier. I think it's a deep question, not one to which I have a great answer. No. Other thoughts or questions, Eva?
Coming from Germany or
Yeah.
living in Germany
Yeah.
those days, are there any lessons learned from different countries, from different economies that we
Yeah.
could apply here in the US?
Yeah, no, I think there are great lessons in both directions. The first thing I'd say is our focus here, and I worried about it for an audience as international as Google, right? The focus here is in the U.S. I view, the HBS we teach by the case method. I view the U.S. as essentially the world's largest case study, right? I think many of the issues we see here in different variants apply to advanced economies around the world. I think there are indicators that the same kinds of problems are arising around the world. Brexit, actually the vote in Germany just recently, right? I mean, I think we can see that showing up in the rise of the far right. Are there lessons from the rest of the world that the U.S. can learn? Absolutely. And I think probably the apprenticeship system, the educational system in Northern Europe may be the best example. The U.S., for very good reasons, very well-intended reasons, got on a kick toward college for all, right? And somehow or another got the impression out there among individuals that a college degree, a bachelor's degree, no matter what it was in, right, was the path to success. And other kinds of blue-collar jobs, just they weren't knowledge work, they weren't worthy, right? You couldn't convince your parents this is where you should go. I think it's proven to be absolutely wrong. And in fact, manufacturing is knowledge work these days, and there are great jobs out there that are unfilled, right? And I think Europe has been much better, much better at making sure the idea of the education was to get people toward fulfilling and prosperous lives, not necessarily toward a college degree. That said, I understand deeply, I hope, why people are so focused on this. I was speaking with an African-American colleague about this, and I was saying, why this college for all thing? And he said, basically, look, when you say something not college for all, what you hear is not college for all. What I hear is college for people who look a certain way and not college for other people. So how we create multiple paths to prosperity, as some colleagues at the Ed School have put it, while also creating opportunity that's fairly broadly spread, I think it's something that's a uniquely American challenge, and we've got to take things like the apprenticeship system from Europe and figure out, how we do it in a way that's tailored to this country. I'll just end with one last word. I genuinely think we are at crossroads in the country. But the good news is there actually are two paths. We're actually at a crossroads, right? There's one path, which is kind of a path toward unity, where, for instance, business leaders understand the enlightened self-interest they have, that they invest in the commons, they work with the local government, and we actually build the commons back up. There's another path, unfortunately, which is a path toward division. And it's a path where politicians realize that given the media we've got, dividing us against one another is the path toward success, and business interests pursue their narrow self-interest, and we don't address issues in the financial sector or other sectors of our economy, and we let the commons deteriorate. But I think there are generally two paths, and the cool part about it is we actually get to decide. There are forces of globalization or technological change which make one path a little rockier than the other, but individually and collectively, we can choose the path, and I hope we all choose the right one. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your questions and for your time today. Thanks.